The crack of a gavel shattered Cordelia Frost's world on a sweltering summer afternoon in 1876. Her father, red-faced and whiskey drunk, had just sold her to a stranger for $50 and a deed to a worthless silver mine. The auction block beneath her feet felt like shifting sand as she struggled to comprehend that her own blood had betrayed her so completely. "Sold to Mr. Hargrove," the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the dusty main street of Miles City, Montana. Cordelia's fingers dug into her palms, blood pooling beneath her nails as she fought the urge to run. Her pale blue dress, worn thin at the elbows and stained with the remnants of yesterday's chores, hung limply in the oppressive heat. At 20 years old, she had become property, traded away by a father who valued whiskey more than his own daughter. Mr. Hargrove, a man with yellowing teeth and eyes that reminded Cordelia of a hungry wolf, stepped forward. His reputation as the owner of a brothel 2 towns over preceded him, and his intentions were as transparent as they were vile. She'd be lucky to survive a year under his care. "I'll take good care of this one," Hargrove announced to the small crowd, his meaty hand already reaching for her arm. "Pretty little thing like you will make me a fortune." Cordelia recoiled, but there was nowhere to run. The crowd of onlookers, neighbors she'd known her entire life, averted their eyes, shame evident in their postures but not enough to inspire intervention. Her younger brother stood at the edge of the gathering, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face. At 14, Tim was helpless to save her. Just as Hargrove's fingers brushed against her skin, a voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. $100. A hush fell over the gathering as heads turned toward the source of the interruption. A tall figure moved through the parting crowd, spurs jingling with each purposeful step. The stranger's face was partially obscured by the brim of a well-worn Stetson, but Cordelia could see a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes that gleamed like polished steel. "This auction is closed," the auctioneer stammered, looking nervously between the newcomer and Hargrove. $200, the stranger countered, stepping into the circle of onlookers. "Cash in hand." He pulled a leather pouch from his vest pocket and held it aloft, Hargrove's face contorted with rage. "Now see here, 300, the stranger interrupted, his voice steady and determined. The crowd gasped. It was more money than most of them saw in a year. Cordelia watched the exchange with wide eyes, hope and dread battling within her chest. One master for another, she thought bitterly. Hargrove's nostrils flared as he assessed his opponent, a cowboy in dusty riding clothes, with a Colt revolver strapped to his hip, and the hard-earned physique of a man who spent his life in the saddle. "The girl isn't worth that much," Hargrove snarled, though his eyes betrayed his frustration. "Then I suggest you stop bidding," the cowboy replied, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made the crowd step back. A tense silence stretched between the two men. Finally, Hargrove spat on the ground near the cowboy's boots and stormed away, muttering curses under his breath. The cowboy approached the auctioneer, counting out bills from his pouch before turning to Cordelia's father, who had sobered slightly at the prospect of additional money. "You're a disgrace," the cowboy told him quietly, though his words carried in the still air. Cordelia's father flinched but said nothing as he pocketed the money. The cowboy then turned to Cordelia, removing his hat to reveal sun-bleached brown hair. His eyes, now visible, were indeed steel gray but held something unexpected compassion. "Miss," he said, offering his hand to help her down from the auction block. "My name is Knox Weston." Cordelia hesitated, eyeing his outstretched hand with suspicion. "I haven't purchased you," Knox continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I've purchased your freedom. Now choose your own path." Stunned, Cordelia stared at him, searching for deception in his weathered face and finding none. "Why would you do that?" she whispered, still not taking his hand. "Because no person should be property," he answered simply. "The choice is yours now. Go wherever you wish." "I ask nothing in return." A murmur rippled through the crowd as people began to understand what was happening. Cordelia's brother pushed forward, hope lighting his young face. "Cordelia," Tim called out, his voice cracking. She looked at her brother, then back at Knox Weston. In that moment, she made a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted, finally accepting Knox's hand and stepping down from the auction block. The dirt of the main street felt more solid beneath her feet than the auction platform had. "I have a small ranch 10 miles outside of town," Knox replied. "I could use a housekeeper, paid fair wages. You'd have your own cabin and be free to leave whenever you choose." "Cordelia, no," her father suddenly bellowed, staggering forward. The smell of whiskey rolled off him in waves. "You ungrateful!" Knox turned, placing himself between Cordelia and her father. He didn't reach for his weapon, but his posture made it clear he would brook no interference. "You've been paid," Knox said coldly. "Your business with your daughter is concluded." Cordelia's father wavered, fury and alcohol making him unsteady. For a terrible moment she thought he might lunge at Knox, but instead he spat on the ground and stumbled away toward the nearest saloon. "Tim," Cordelia called to her brother, "come with us." The boy looked torn, glancing back at their family's dilapidated cabin at the edge of town. "Go pack your things, boy," Knox told him gently. "Your sister will be waiting." Tim nodded and ran off, disappearing down a side street. As the crowd dispersed, Cordelia stood beside her unlikely savior, struggling to process the dramatic turn her fate had taken in mere minutes. "Why did you really do this?" she asked again, studying Knox's face in the harsh afternoon sunlight. "My mother was sold to pay my father's debts when I was 10, he answered, his eyes distant with memory. "No one stepped in to help her. I swore if I ever saw such a thing again and had the means to stop it, I would." Cordelia absorbed this, wondering what kind of man Knox Weston truly was and what awaited her at his ranch. Freedom, he'd said, but experience had taught her that men's promises were often as substantial as smoke. "I'll work hard," she said finally, "until I can repay you." Knox replaced his hat, shaking his head slightly. "There's nothing to repay, Miss Frost. The money was a small price for doing what's right." An hour later, with Tim seated behind her on Knox's sturdy bay gelding and her few belongings tied in a bundle, Cordelia left Miles City. As they rode past the town limits, she didn't look back at the place that had been her prison for 20 years. Instead, she fixed her eyes on the vast Montana landscape stretching before them, and for the first time in her life, allowed herself to hope. The journey to Knox's ranch took them through rolling grasslands dotted with sagebrush and the occasional stand of cottonwoods. The summer heat shimmered above the earth, making distant mountains waver like mirages. Cordelia, unaccustomed to horseback riding, clung to the saddle horn as Knox led them along a well-worn trail. Not much farther, Knox assured them as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. "You doing all right back there, Tim?" "Yes, sir," Tim replied, his voice steadier than it had been in town. The boy had always been resilient, Cordelia thought with a surge of pride. Despite their father's neglect and their mother's death 5 years prior, Tim had maintained a quiet dignity beyond his years. "There it is," Knox said finally, pointing toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley. A creek wound its way through the property, its banks lined with willows and cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. A modest one-story house constructed of rough-hewn logs stood at the center, flanked by a barn, corral, and several smaller outbuildings. "It's not much," Knox continued, "but the land is good and the water runs year-round." "It's beautiful," Cordelia replied honestly. After the squalor of their family's cabin in town, Knox's ranch appeared almost palatial. As they approached, a figure emerged from the barn, a stocky older man with a shock of white hair and a face creased by decades in the sun. "Hank," Knox called out, "we've got company." The old man shaded his eyes against the setting sun, observing Knox's companions with obvious curiosity. "This is Hank Morgan," Knox explained as they drew closer. "He's been with me since I started this place 5 years ago. Best horseman in 3 territories and a fair cook besides." "When I have to be," Hank replied gruffly, though his eyes twinkled with good humor. "Who have you brought home this time, boss? More strays?" Knox dismounted in one fluid motion, then helped Cordelia down from the horse. Her legs trembled from the unaccustomed ride. "Miss Cordelia Frost and her brother Tim," Knox said. "They'll be staying with us. Miss Frost will be taking over the housekeeping, and I expect Tim here might make a fine ranch hand with proper training." Hank's bushy eyebrows rose slightly, but he merely nodded and extended a calloused hand first to Cordelia and then to Tim, who had scrambled down from the horse on his own. "Pleased to meet you both," Hank said. "Any friend of Knox's is welcome here." "Thank you," Cordelia replied, finding her voice. "We're grateful for your hospitality." "I'll show you to your cabin," Knox said, retrieving their meager belongings from his horse. "You can get settled in and then join us for supper if you're feeling up to it." The cabin he led them to was small but clean, with 2 rooms separated by a curtain of rough fabric. A cast iron stove occupied one corner, and simple furniture, a table with 2 chairs. A narrow bed in each room and a chest for storage filled the space. Someone had placed a vase of wildflowers on the table, their bright colors incongruously cheerful. "Hank must have put those there," Knox commented, noticing Cordelia's gaze. "He's gruff, but he has his moments." "It's perfect," Tim declared, already exploring the second room that would be his own. "The pump outside draws clean water," Knox explained. "Outhouse is behind the cabin. There's linens in the chest and firewood stacked outside. I'll leave you to get settled." He paused at the door. "Supper's at sundown, but no obligation. I understand if you'd prefer to rest tonight." After he left, Cordelia sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. That morning, she had risen before dawn to prepare breakfast for her father and brother in their cramped cabin. By noon, she had been standing on an auction block. And now, as the sun set on the same tumultuous day, she was. "What, free, a paid employee, a charity case, Delia," Tim said, using his childhood nickname for her. "Are we really safe here?" Cordelia looked at her brother's face, still round with youth but already showing signs of the man he would become. She wished she could give him certainty. "I think so," she replied carefully, "but we'll be careful until we know for sure." Tim nodded, accepting her measured response. "He seems different from father." "Most men are," Cordelia said, though her experience with men beyond her father was limited to brief interactions in town. "Now, let's wash up and join them for supper. It would be rude to refuse their hospitality on our first night." The main house's interior surprised Cordelia. Though the exterior was rustic, inside was unexpectedly comfortable, with polished wooden floors partially covered by woven rugs and walls adorned with a few simple paintings. Bookshelves lined one wall of the main room, filled with volumes that spoke of an educated mind. Hank was setting a pot of something fragrant on the table when they entered, and Knox was removing his gun belt, hanging it on a peg by the door. "Just in time," Hank announced. "Hope you like venison stew." Knox brought down a deer last week, and we've been working through it." "It smells wonderful," Cordelia said truthfully, her stomach reminding her that she hadn't eaten since morning. The meal passed pleasantly, with Hank regaling them with tales of ranch life while Knox mostly listened, offering occasional comments or corrections. Tim, initially shy, gradually joined the conversation, asking questions about the horses and cattle. "You ever ridden before, boy?" Hank asked Tim. "No, sir," Tim admitted. "Father never had horses." "Well, we'll fix that tomorrow," Hank declared. "Can't work a ranch without riding. Knox, that old pony of yours would be good for the boy to start on." Knox nodded. "Clover's gentle enough. We can begin after breakfast." He turned to Cordelia. "As for the housekeeping, there's no rush. Take a few days to settle in." "I'd prefer to start tomorrow," Cordelia said firmly. "I'm not accustomed to idleness." Something like approval flickered in Knox's eyes. "As you wish. Hank's been managing, but a woman's touch would be welcome." The house has been neglected in some respects. After the meal, Knox insisted on walking them back to their cabin, a lantern lighting their path through the darkness. "Lock your door tonight if it makes you feel safer," he told Cordelia quietly as Tim walked ahead. "But know that you have nothing to fear here." Cordelia studied his face in the lantern light, trying to discern his true character. "Thank you, Mr. Weston, for everything." He nodded once, then handed her the lantern. "Good night, Miss Frost." That night, lying in a bed cleaner and more comfortable than any she had known, Cordelia stared at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, the occasional howl of a coyote. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as her mind churned with questions. Who was Knox Weston really? A genuinely good man, or someone with ulterior motives yet to be revealed? And what would become of her and Tim in this new life thrust upon them so suddenly? Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the cabin's small windows. Cordelia rose early, as was her habit, and found that someone had left a basket outside their door containing fresh eggs, a loaf of bread, coffee, and a small jar of preserves. A note in a neat, masculine hand read simply, "For your breakfast, K.W." The thoughtfulness of the gesture moved her unexpectedly. She prepared a simple meal for herself and Tim, who woke with more enthusiasm than she had seen from him in months. "Do you think Mr. Weston will really teach me to ride today?" he asked, wolfing down his breakfast. "I expect he'll keep his word," Cordelia replied, watching her brother's excitement with a mixture of joy and caution. She didn't want him to be disappointed if their situation changed, as it had so often in their difficult lives. After breakfast, Tim rushed off to find Knox and Hank, while Cordelia approached the main house, determined to prove her worth. The door was unlocked, and she entered hesitantly, calling out a greeting. Receiving no response, she began to assess her new domain. The common areas were reasonably tidy but in need of a thorough cleaning. She found cleaning supplies in a pantry off the kitchen and set to work, beginning with the windows to let in more light. Hours passed as she scrubbed, dusted, and organized, finding satisfaction in the transformation of each space. The physical labor helped quiet her restless thoughts, allowing her to focus solely on the task at hand rather than the precariousness of her situation. She was on her hands and knees scrubbing the kitchen floor when Knox returned, the sound of his boots on the porch giving her only a moment's warning before the door opened. She scrambled to her feet, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance, hair escaping its pins, dress damp with soapy water. Knox paused in the doorway, taking in the gleaming surfaces and organized shelves. "You've been busy," he observed, removing his hat. There was much to be done, she replied, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. More than I realized, apparently. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The place hasn't looked this good since. Well, ever. Where's Tim? She asked, changing the subject, with Hank at the corral. He's a natural on horseback, took to it right away. Pride colored his voice as though Tim were his own kin. You should see him. I will once I finish here, Cordelia promised, returning to her task. Knox watched her for a moment longer. You don't need to work so hard on your first day. This isn't a test. Cordelia looked up, meeting his gaze directly. Perhaps not for you, Mr. Weston, but for me, everything is a test until proven otherwise. Something shifted in his expression, understanding, perhaps, or respect. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. But at least take a break for lunch. You must be hungry. She realized suddenly. The morning had passed without her noticing the time. I can prepare something, she offered, rising again. No need. I made sandwiches before coming to find you. They're on the porch with some lemonade. Join me when you're ready. With that, he turned and left her to finish her work. When Cordelia stepped onto the porch 10 minutes later, having tidied herself as best she could, she found Knox seated in one of 2 rocking chairs, a plate of sandwiches and a pitcher on the small table between them. This is kind of you, she said, taking the offered seat. It's nothing special, he replied, pouring her a glass of lemonade. But Hank will be keeping Tim occupied for a while yet, so I thought we might talk. Cordelia accepted the glass, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. About what, Mr. Weston? For one thing, I'd like you to call me Knox. Mr. Weston makes me feel like my father. He smiled slightly, the expression transforming his stern features. Very well. Knox, she agreed, finding the informality strange but not unwelcome. And you may call me Cordelia. Cordelia, he repeated, as though testing the sound of her name. I want to be clear about your position here. You and Tim are not servants. You're employees, free to leave at any time. You'll be paid fair wages, $15 a month for housekeeping duties, with Sundays off. Tim will earn $5 monthly to start, increasing as he learns more skills. Cordelia nearly choked on her lemonade. The amount was generous, far more than she would have expected. That's too much, she protested. It's the going rate, Knox countered. I won't pay you less than I would anyone else doing the same work. She studied him, trying to reconcile this fair-minded man with her experience of men in general. Why are you doing all this? The truth, please. Knox's gaze shifted to the distant mountains, his expression growing contemplative. I told you about my mother, he said finally. What I didn't say was that after she was sold, I never saw her again. I was raised by my grandfather, a hard but decent man. He taught me that a man's character is defined by what he does when no one is watching, and by how he treats those with less power than himself. He paused, taking a sip of his lemonade before continuing. When I saw you on that auction block, I couldn't walk away, not when I had the means to help. As for bringing you here, I've needed help with the house for some time, and you needed a safe place. It seemed a fair arrangement. And Tim, every ranch can use another good hand, Knox said simply. Besides, I wouldn't separate siblings. Family is too precious for that. Cordelia digested his words, finding no deceit in them. I'm grateful, she said finally. More than I can express, but I want you to know that I intend to repay your kindness, not just with work, but by actually repaying the money you spent. Knox shook his head. That's unnecessary. It's necessary to me, she interrupted firmly. I won't be beholden to anyone, not even a benefactor as kind as you seem to be. Their eyes met in a silent contest of wills. Finally, Knox nodded. Very well. If that's what you wish, we can consider it a loan rather than a gift, but there's no hurry to repay it. Satisfied, Cordelia reached for a sandwich. They ate in companionable silence, the summer breeze rustling the cottonwoods and carrying the distant sounds of ranch life, the nickering of horses, Hank's booming laugh, and somewhere, Tim's delighted whoop. In that peaceful moment, Cordelia allowed herself to believe, just briefly, that perhaps their luck had finally changed. The days stretched into weeks as summer's heat gave way to the golden hues of early autumn. Cordelia settled into a routine, rising with the sun to prepare breakfast for the ranch's inhabitants, then spending her days tending to the house, mending clothes, and helping with the garden that provided much of their fresh food. Tim flourished under Knox and Hank's tutelage, growing inches seemingly overnight and developing the confident bearing of a young man who had found his place in the world. He learned to ride, rope, and mend fences with an enthusiasm that warmed Cordelia's heart. Knox proved to be a fair employer and a considerate housemate. He kept his distance, always respectful of Cordelia's privacy and independence. Their interactions were primarily at mealtimes or during the occasional evening when all four of them gathered in the main house to read or play cards. Despite his reserve, Cordelia found herself increasingly drawn to Knox. She observed him when he wasn't looking, the gentle way he handled frightened animals, his patience teaching Tim, the quiet intensity with which he studied ledgers in the evening. He was a complex man, she realized, with depths that weren't immediately apparent. One crisp September morning, Cordelia was hanging laundry when she noticed a plume of dust on the horizon. Visitors were rare at the remote ranch, and she felt a flutter of unease as she watched a rider approach. Knox emerged from the barn, hand resting casually on his holstered revolver as he moved to intercept the visitor. Cordelia abandoned her laundry and hurried toward them, an inexplicable sense of dread propelling her forward. As she drew nearer, the rider's identity became clear and her blood turned to ice. It was her father, swaying slightly in the saddle of a borrowed horse, his face flushed with alcohol even at this early hour. "There's my ungrateful daughter," he slurred, pointing an accusatory finger at Cordelia. "Ran off with my boy, she did." Knox positioned himself between Cordelia and her father. "Mr. Frost," he said coolly, "you're trespassing on private property." "Come to get what's mine," Frost declared, struggling to dismount. He nearly fell before righting himself, staggering slightly. "The boy, he's coming home with me." "Tim stays here," Cordelia said, finding her voice despite the fear churning in her stomach. "He's safe and happy." "He's my son," Frost roared, taking an unsteady step toward her. Knox moved forward, his posture tense but controlled. "Mr. Frost, you sold your rights to your daughter. You have no claim on either of them now." "The auction was for the girl," Frost argued, spittle flying from his lips. "The boy wasn't part of the deal." "The law might disagree," Knox replied evenly. "Abandonment has its consequences. Besides, Tim is old enough to choose for himself." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Tim appeared from around the side of the barn, freezing when he saw his father. Hank was close behind, his weathered hand coming to rest protectively on the boy's shoulder. "Tim," Frost bellowed. "Get over here, boy. We're going home." Tim looked from his father to Cordelia, his young face a mask of fear and resolution. "No, father," he said clearly. "I'm staying here." Frost's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" He lunged forward, but his drunken state made him clumsy. Knox intercepted him easily, restraining him without apparent effort. "That's enough," Knox said, his voice deadly quiet. "You'll leave now, Mr. Frost, and not return. If you have legitimate business with your children, you can state it in town before witnesses and while sober." "You think you're better than me," Frost spat, struggling against Knox's grip. Stealing a man's family, turning them against him. You're nothing but a— Knox tightened his hold slightly, cutting off Frost's tirade. I won't tell you again. Leave. For a tense moment, it seemed Frost might continue to fight, but something in Knox's demeanor must have penetrated his alcohol-addled brain. He wrenched free, stumbling backward. "This isn't over," he threatened, glaring at Cordelia and Tim in turn. "You'll regret this, both of you." He struggled back onto his horse, nearly falling twice before managing to seat himself. With a final venomous look, he wheeled the animal around and galloped unsteadily away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Silence fell over the ranch yard. Tim's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly despite Hank's reassuring presence. Cordelia felt hollow, the familiar shame and fear of her father's presence lingering like a bad taste. "He'll be back," she said quietly, watching the retreating figure grow smaller against the vast landscape. Knox turned to her, his expression grave. "Probably, but next time we'll be prepared." "I won't go with him," Tim declared, his young voice cracking with emotion. "I'd run away first." "No one's going anywhere," Knox assured him. "This is your home now, both of you, for as long as you want it to be." Home. The word resonated within Cordelia, both comforting and frightening in its implications. Could they truly build a home here under Knox's protection? Or was this just another temporary refuge in a lifetime of uncertainty? That evening, after Tim had gone to bed, Cordelia found herself unable to sleep. The confrontation with her father had unearthed memories and emotions she had been trying to bury since arriving at the ranch. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, seeking solace in the star-filled Montana sky. To her surprise, Knox was seated on the porch of the main house, a lantern burning low beside him as he whittled a piece of wood. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, setting aside his project. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked as she approached. Cordelia shook her head, hesitating at the bottom of the steps. "May I join you, of course?" He gestured to the empty chair beside him. She settled into it, drawing her shawl tighter against the evening chill. For several minutes, they sat in companionable silence, the night sounds of crickets and distant coyotes filling the air. "I'm sorry for the trouble my father brought to your doorstep," Cordelia finally said. Knox resumed his whittling, the soft scrape of knife against wood a soothing rhythm. "You have nothing to apologize for. A man chooses his own path. Your father has chosen a poor one. Still, I feel responsible." If you weren't here," Knox interrupted gently, "I'd be eating Hank's terrible cooking and living in a house coated with dust. Your presence has been a blessing, not a burden." The sincerity in his voice warmed something deep within her. "Thank you for saying that. And for standing up to him today." Knox was silent for a moment, his knife stilling. "Cordelia, there's something you should know about why I was in Miles City that day." She turned to look at him, curious about his suddenly serious tone. "I was there to meet with the bank," he continued. "The ranch has been struggling. Cattle prices are down, and last winter was hard on the herd. I'd gone to negotiate an extension on a loan." Cordelia absorbed this information, understanding dawning. "So the money you spent on the auction was meant for the bank," he confirmed. "But I couldn't regret the choice, not when I saw you standing there." "Knox," she breathed, dismayed. "Why didn't you tell me? I would never have accepted such generosity had I known it put your ranch at risk." "It was my decision to make," he said firmly, "and I'd make the same choice again." "But your ranch will survive," he finished. "We had a good summer. The fall cattle drive should bring enough to satisfy the bank, at least for now." Cordelia was silent, processing the magnitude of what he had done for her and Tim. The sacrifice was far greater than she had realized. "I insist on repaying you," she said finally. "Every cent with interest. Knox smiled slightly, returning to his whittling. "Your stubbornness is remarkable, Miss Frost." "As is your recklessness, Mr. Weston," she countered, though there was no sting in her words. Their eyes met in the lantern light, something unspoken passing between them. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Cordelia allowed herself to acknowledge the growing attraction she felt toward this man who had risked so much for strangers. "What are you making?" she asked, nodding toward the piece of wood in his hands, needing to break the moment before it overwhelmed her. "A horse," he replied, showing her the rough shape emerging from the wood. "For Tim's birthday next month." Hank mentioned the boy admired his collection of carvings. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. "He'll treasure it," she said softly. They lapsed into silence again, but it was comfortable now, intimate in a way that required no words. When Cordelia finally rose to return to her cabin, she felt calmer than she had all day. "Good night, Knox," she said, pausing at the top of the steps. "Good night, Cordelia," he replied, his gaze following her as she disappeared into the darkness. That night, she slept soundly, her dreams filled not with her father's threats but with the steady presence of a man who carved horses for a boy not his own and risked his livelihood to save a woman he'd never met. The autumn days grew shorter as the ranch prepared for winter. Knox and Hank, along with several hired hands who joined them temporarily, drove most of the cattle to market in Billings, returning 2 weeks later with enough money to satisfy the bank, at least until spring. Tim's 14th birthday arrived on a clear October day. Knox presented him with the carved horse, now polished to a warm glow and mounted on a small wooden base. The boy's face lit with delight as he examined the detailed craftsmanship. "It looks just like Clover," he exclaimed, referring to the pony he had learned to ride. "Thank you, Knox. It's the finest gift I've ever received." Cordelia had baked a cake with precious sugar and dried fruits, and they celebrated that evening with a special dinner. As she watched her brother's animated conversation with Knox and Hank, she marveled at how much he had changed in just 3 months. The frightened, withdrawn boy from Miles City had been replaced by a confident young man who spoke of cattle breeding and horse training with growing expertise. Later that week, the first snow dusted the mountains, a reminder that winter would soon envelop the ranch in earnest. Knox and Hank worked tirelessly to prepare, repairing outbuildings, stocking firewood, and ensuring adequate feed for the animals. Cordelia contributed by preserving the last of the garden's produce and mending clothes for the cold months ahead. One evening in early November, as Cordelia was returning to her cabin after dinner, Knox fell into step beside her, a lantern lighting their path through the gathering darkness. "I need to ride into town tomorrow for supplies," he said. "Would you care to join me? There might be things you and Tim need for winter." The invitation surprised her. In the month since their arrival, neither she nor Tim had returned to Miles City. "I'd like that," she replied, realizing it was true despite her mixed feelings about the town. They set out the following morning under a sky heavy with the promise of snow. Tim elected to remain behind with Hank, who was teaching him to repair tack, a skill that would serve him well in the coming months when outdoor work would be limited by weather. The journey to town was pleasant despite the cold, with Knox pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history. Cordelia found herself laughing at his dry observations about local characters, including a legendary hermit who was said to communicate with bears. Miles City appeared much as they crested a small rise, its collection of wooden buildings nestled along the Yellowstone River. Cordelia felt a flutter of anxiety as they approached, memories of the auction block threatening to resurface. Knox seemed to sense her discomfort. "We'll make quick work of our errands," he assured her, and we can avoid the main street if you prefer." "No," she said, straightening her spine. "I won't hide. This is as much my town as anyone's." His approving glance bolstered her courage as they rode into the bustling settlement. They tied their horses outside the general store, and Knox helped her down, his hands lingering briefly at her waist before he stepped away. The storekeeper greeted Knox warmly and nodded politely to Cordelia, showing no sign of recognizing her from the auction. They selected supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples that would supplement the ranch's stores. Knox insisted that Cordelia choose fabric for new curtains and clothing, as well as books for the long winter evenings. As they were completing their purchases, the store's door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and an unwelcome figure: Harold Hargrove, the man who had nearly purchased Cordelia that fateful day. Hargrove stopped short when he saw them, his piggy eyes narrowing with recognition. "Well, well," he drawled, "if it isn't the cowboy and his bought woman." Knox's posture stiffened, but his voice remained level. "Good day, Mr. Hargrove. We were just leaving." Hargrove blocked their path to the door. "Not so fast. I've been wondering how you're enjoying my property, Weston." His gaze slid to Cordelia, undressing her with his eyes. "She worth the price you paid?" Before Knox could respond, Cordelia stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "I am no man's property, Mr. Hargrove. I never was and never will be." Hargrove's face darkened with anger. "You forget yourself, girl. Women like you should be treated with respect," Knox interrupted, his hand moving subtly toward his holstered revolver. "Something you clearly know nothing about." The storekeeper, sensing trouble, moved nervously behind his counter. "Gentlemen, please." "Not in my establishment." Hargrove assessed Knox's stance and apparently thought better of pressing the issue. "Another time, perhaps," he sneered, stepping aside. "Enjoy her while you can, Weston. Women like that always show their true colors eventually." Knox's jaw tightened, but he placed a gentle hand on Cordelia's back, guiding her past Hargrove and out of the store. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft flakes drifting from the leaden sky. "I'm sorry about that," Knox said quietly as they secured their purchases to the horses. "It's not your fault," Cordelia replied, trying to shake off the encounter. "Men like Hargrove are everywhere." "Not everywhere," Knox corrected, helping her mount her horse, "and they don't define this town or its people." As if to prove his point, several passers-by greeted them warmly as they rode toward the center of town. A few even addressed Cordelia by name, asking after Tim and treating her with a respect that gradually eased her tension. Their last stop was the bank, where Knox needed to discuss the terms of his loan. While he conducted his business, Cordelia waited in the lobby, examining a notice board covered with advertisements and announcements. One in particular caught her eye: a posting for a teaching position at the newly established school on the edge of town. The salary was modest but respectable, and the requirements included a high school education and good moral character. Before her mother's death, Cordelia had attended school regularly, even completing high school, an unusual achievement for a girl in Miles City. Her mother, a former schoolteacher herself, had insisted on education for both her children, often tutoring them at home when formal schooling wasn't available. When Knox emerged from his meeting, Cordelia pointed out the notice. "I might qualify for this," she said tentatively. Knox studied the posting, then looked at her with undisguised admiration. "You're educated." "My mother was a teacher before she married," Cordelia explained. "She made certain Tim and I learned as much as possible. I completed high school 2 years ago." "You should apply," Knox said immediately. "If it's what you want." His ready support touched her. "It would mean living in town," she said, watching his reaction carefully. Something flickered in his eyes, disappointment, perhaps, but he nodded. The ranch would miss you, but this is an excellent opportunity. Remember what I said when we first met. The choice is yours. Cordelia felt a surge of gratitude for this man who consistently supported her independence, even when it might inconvenience him. I'll think about it, she promised. As they left the bank, the snow began falling more heavily, transforming the dusty streets into a white wonderland. Knox glanced at the sky with concern. We should head back soon, he said. This storm looks to be worsening. They completed their remaining errands quickly and turned their horses toward home. The temperature dropped rapidly as they rode, and the gentle snowfall became a driving storm, the wind whipping ice crystals against their faces. We need to find shelter, Knox called over the howling wind, his voice barely audible. There's a line shack about 2 miles ahead. We can wait out the worst of it there. Cordelia nodded, too cold to speak. She followed Knox's lead, trusting him to guide them through the blinding white landscape. By the time the small shack appeared, a dark smudge against the snow, her fingers were numb despite her gloves, and her face felt frozen. Knox dismounted quickly, leading both horses to a lean-to attached to the side of the shack. He helped Cordelia down, her stiff limbs barely responding to commands. Inside, he urged, grabbing essential supplies from their packs. Quickly. The shack was a single room with a small iron stove, a narrow cot, and little else. Knox immediately set about starting a fire, his movements efficient despite the cold. Cordelia huddled near the door, shivering uncontrollably as her body registered the relative warmth. You need to get out of those wet clothes, Knox said, not looking at her as the fire caught and began to grow. There should be blankets in that trunk. Cordelia moved stiffly to the wooden trunk, finding several rough wool blankets inside. I see can't change with you here, she stammered through chattering teeth. Knox nodded, already heading for the door. I'll check on the horses. Call when you're decent. Alone, Cordelia struggled out of her frozen outer garments, leaving on her chemise and drawers, which were relatively dry. She wrapped herself in 2 blankets and moved closer to the fire, feeling returning painfully to her extremities. Knox, she called when she was settled. You can come back. He re-entered, bringing another blast of cold air that made the fire dance wildly. Snow dusted his shoulders and hat, and his face was red from the wind. The horses are sheltered and fed, he reported, removing his coat and hat. But we won't be going anywhere until this passes. Cordelia nodded, watching as he hung their wet garments near the stove. How long do you think we'll be here? Hard to say. These early winter storms can blow themselves out in hours or last for days. He looked at her with concern. Are you warming up? Yes, thank you. She shifted slightly, making room for him by the fire. You should warm yourself too. Knox hesitated briefly before sitting beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. I'm sorry about this, he said. I should have checked the weather more carefully before suggesting the trip. It's not your fault, she assured him. Montana weather is famously unpredictable. They sat in companionable silence for a time, the fire crackling cheerfully in contrast to the storm raging outside. Gradually, Cordelia's shivering subsided, and she felt herself relaxing, the day's tensions Hargrove, the decision about the teaching position, the dangerous journey receding in the face of immediate comfort and safety. Are you hungry? Knox asked eventually, reaching for their supplies. Starving, she admitted with a small smile. He produced bread, cheese, and dried apples from his pack, along with a flask of coffee. They made a simple meal of it, sharing the food and passing the flask between them. Tell me about your ranch, Cordelia said as they ate. How did you come to own it? Knox's expression softened with fondness. I worked cattle drives for years, saving every penny. 5 years ago, I had enough for a down payment on this land. It was nothing than just open grassland with a creek running through it. Hank and I built the house and barn ourselves that first summer. It's beautiful land, Cordelia observed. You've created something wonderful there. It's been hard work, Knox admitted. And there have been times like this past year when I wasn't sure we'd make it. But I can't imagine any other life now. And you never married. The question slipped out before she could reconsider it, and Cordelia immediately felt her cheeks warm. Forgive me, that's too personal. No, it's a fair question, Knox replied, his gaze fixed on the fire. There was someone once, when I was younger. Elizabeth, the daughter of a rancher I worked for in Wyoming. We were engaged briefly, but she decided ranch life wasn't what she wanted. She married a banker in Cheyenne instead. I'm sorry, Cordelia said softly, hearing the old pain beneath his matter-of-fact tone. Knox shrugged. It was for the best. She would have been unhappy, and so would I eventually. And you? I assume there's a reason you were still living with your father at your age. Cordelia sighed, drawing the blanket tighter around her shoulders. After my mother died, someone needed to care for Tim. My father deteriorated quickly without her. The drinking got worse, and so did his temper. There were opportunities to leave. A shopkeeper's son expressed interest in courting me 2 years ago, but I couldn't abandon Tim. You're a good sister, Knox said, his admiration evident. I did what anyone would do, she demurred. No, Knox said firmly, not anyone. Many would have looked to their own happiness first. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and Cordelia felt something shift, a current passing between them that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. Knox cleared his throat, breaking the moment. You should take the cot, he said, rising to his feet. I'll sleep here by the fire. The cot is too small for either of us to be comfortable, Cordelia pointed out practically. We could share the floor near the fire. With separate blankets, she added hastily, not wanting him to misinterpret her suggestion. Knox hesitated, then nodded. If you're certain you wouldn't be uncomfortable. I trust you, she said simply, and realized as the words left her mouth that they were entirely true. They arranged their makeshift beds on opposite sides of the fire, close enough for warmth, but with a clear space between them. As night deepened outside, the storm continued its assault on the small shack, wind howling through cracks in the walls despite Knox's efforts to seal them with spare blankets. Lying in the flickering firelight, Cordelia found herself studying Knox's profile as he stared into the flames. The strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, the way his hair fell across his forehead, all had become dear to her in ways she had not permitted herself to acknowledge until now. Knox, she said softly, if I were to take the teaching position, would you still allow Tim to stay at the ranch? He turned to look at her, surprise evident in his expression. Of course, Tim has found his place with us. He belongs there now, regardless of your decision. Relief washed through her. Thank you. I haven't decided yet, but knowing Tim would be secure makes the choice easier. And you? Knox asked, his voice low. Where do you belong, Cordelia? The question hung between them, laden with implications neither had voiced. Cordelia's heart raced as she considered her answer. I'm still discovering that, she replied honestly. For so long, my only purpose was survival for Tim and myself. Now, for the first time, I have choices, real choices. It's overwhelming sometimes. Knox nodded, understanding in his eyes. There's no rush to decide. The ranch will always have a place for you, whatever else you choose to do. Even if I were to teach, even then, he confirmed. Miles City is close enough to ride to the ranch regularly. You could have both lives if that's what you want. The generosity of his perspective moved her deeply. In her experience, men tended to see women as possessions, not as individuals with dreams and ambitions of their own. Knox's consistent respect for her autonomy was perhaps the quality she admired most in him. "What do you want, Knox?" she asked, turning his question back on him. He was silent for a long moment, the firelight playing across his features. "Happiness," he said finally. "For myself and those I care about. Beyond that, I'm still discovering too." The simplicity and honesty of his answer resonated with her own feelings. They fell silent, the storm's fury gradually subsiding outside as sleep claimed them both. Cordelia woke to sunlight streaming through the shack's single window. She blinked, disoriented momentarily before remembering where she was. The fire had burned down to embers, but the room remained reasonably warm. Knox was already up, his blankets neatly folded. She sat up, running a hand through her tangled hair as the door opened. Knox entered, bringing a blast of cold air and blinding white light with him. "Good morning," he greeted her, stomping snow from his boots. "The storm's passed. We have clear skies and about 2 feet of fresh snow." "Can we make it back to the ranch?" Cordelia asked, wrapping her blanket around her shoulders as she rose. "Yes, but it won't be easy going," Knox replied, adding wood to the fire. "We should eat something before setting out. It'll be a long, cold ride." While Knox prepared a simple breakfast from their supplies, Cordelia dressed in her now dry clothes, using the trunk as a makeshift screen. They ate quickly, eager to begin the journey home. Outside, the world had been transformed. The landscape stretched away in pristine white, the morning sun creating a dazzling display as it reflected off the snow. Their horses, rested and fed, seemed eager to be moving despite the difficult conditions. The journey back took twice as long as their ride to town, with Knox breaking trail through the deep snow. They spoke little, conserving energy for the challenging ride. But Cordelia found comfort in the shared experience, another thread binding them together in the tapestry of their evolving relationship. The ranch appeared finally in the early afternoon, smoke rising from both the main house and their cabin chimneys. Tim burst from the barn as they approached, his face alight with relief. "We were worried," he exclaimed as they dismounted stiffly. "Hank was about to ride out looking for you." "The storm caught us by surprise," Knox explained, helping Cordelia down from her horse. "We had to shelter in the line shack overnight." Hank emerged from the house, his weathered face relaxing at the sight of them. "Good to have you back," he said gruffly. "Dinner's nearly ready. You both look like you could use something hot." That evening, after a hearty meal and sharing tales of their adventure, Cordelia returned to her cabin with Tim, exhausted but strangely exhilarated. The experience had shown her something important, that she and Knox worked well together in a crisis, supporting each other without question. It was a foundation upon which something stronger might be built if they both chose that path. As winter settled over the ranch in earnest, life fell into a new rhythm dictated by the season's demands. The days grew shorter, and much of their time was spent indoors, attending to tasks that had been set aside during the busy months of spring, summer, and fall. Cordelia had decided to wait until spring before applying for the teaching position, wanting more time to consider her options and to ensure that Tim was truly settled at the ranch. In the meantime, she discovered unexpected joy in the quiet winter routines, reading by lamplight in the evenings, teaching Tim more advanced mathematics and literature during the day, and sharing meals with Knox and Hank in the cozy warmth of the main house. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive spirit despite their isolation. Cordelia baked cookies and pies from carefully hoarded ingredients, while Tim and Hank constructed crude decorations from pine cones, red berries, and strips of colored fabric. Knox disappeared for 2 days in mid-December, returning with a small pine tree strapped to his horse and saddlebags bulging with mysterious packages. His cheeks were red from cold, but his eyes sparkled with an almost boyish excitement as Tim helped him set up the tree in the main house. "I haven't had a Christmas tree since my mother was alive," Cordelia admitted as they decorated it with the handmade ornaments and a string of popcorn Tim had painstakingly prepared. "Nor have I," Knox replied, standing back to admire their work. "Christmas wasn't a priority for my grandfather, and afterward, well, it didn't seem worth the effort when it was just me." "And now?" she asked, catching his eye. "Now it seems essential," he said simply. On Christmas Eve, they gathered in the main house for a special dinner. Cordelia had spent days preparing, using the last of the summer preserves, and a ham Knox had been saving for the occasion. The table glowed with candles, and even Hank had dressed in his Sunday best, his white hair slicked back with water. After dinner, Knox produced gifts for everyone: a new hat for Hank, a leather-bound journal for Tim, and for Cordelia, a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate design. "Open it," Knox urged gently. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a silver locket on a delicate chain. Cordelia lifted it carefully, opening the clasp to find it empty, waiting for mementos. "For memories yet to be made," Knox explained, watching her face closely. Tears pricked Cordelia's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you," she whispered, immediately placing the chain around her neck. "I'll treasure it always." She had prepared gifts as well-knitted scarves for Hank and Tim, and for Knox, a set of handkerchiefs she had embroidered with his initials during the long winter evenings. It was a humble offering compared to his generosity, but his pleasure seemed genuine as he examined the neat stitching. "These are far too fine for everyday use," he protested. "Nonsense," Cordelia replied with a smile. "They're meant to be used. I can always make more." Later, as Hank and Tim played checkers by the fire, Knox drew Cordelia to the window, where moonlight illuminated the snow-covered landscape. "Are you happy here?" he asked quietly, his gaze searching her face. Cordelia considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said finally. "Happier than I've been since my mother died. Tim is thriving, and I—" She hesitated, then continued honestly, "I've found purpose here and peace." "But not everything you want," Knox pressed gently. Cordelia looked up at him, reading the uncertainty behind his question. "I'm still learning what I want," she admitted. "For so long, wanting things seemed pointless. Now that I can want, that I can choose. It's taking time to trust those feelings." Knox nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Time is something we have plenty of," he said, his hand briefly touching hers where it rested on the windowsill. "No rush, remember." His patience moved her deeply. Other men might have pressed their advantage, might have interpreted her presence in their home as consent to more. Knox consistently demonstrated that her choices mattered to him, that her independence was something he valued rather than feared. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you've given us. Not just shelter and security, but dignity, the freedom to choose." "You've given as much in return," Knox replied, his voice low. "This place was just a house before. You and Tim have made it a home." Their eyes met and held, something unspoken passing between them in the moonlit quiet. Cordelia felt her heart quicken, aware that they were standing at the edge of a precipice, one step away from acknowledging feelings that had been growing steadily since summer. The moment was broken by Tim's triumphant whoop as he won the checkers game, followed by Hank's good-natured grumbling about rematch. Knox smiled, stepping back slightly. "Merry Christmas, Cordelia," he said. "Merry Christmas, Knox." she replied, feeling as though something important had just passed between them, even if words remained unspoken. January brought the coldest days of winter, with temperatures so frigid that outdoor work was limited to essential chores. February followed with relentless snowstorms that left the ranch isolated for weeks at a time. During this period of enforced intimacy, the 4 inhabitants of the ranch grew closer, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future during long evenings by the fire. Cordelia learned more about Knox's years as a cowhand, his travels throughout the Western territories, and his struggles to establish the ranch. In turn, she shared memories of her mother, her own limited travels, and her secret ambition to someday write stories for publication. By March, as the first signs of spring began to appear, Cordelia had made her decision about the teaching position. One evening, after Tim had gone to bed and Hank had retired to his room in the main house, she found Knox on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I've been thinking about the school," she said without preamble, joining him at the railing. Knox turned to her, his expression carefully neutral. "And I've decided not to apply," she said. "At least not now. The ranch needs me and Tim. Well, it would be difficult for him if I were living in town." "Are you certain?" Knox asked, studying her face in the dim light. "I meant what I said about Tim staying here regardless. I don't want you to feel obligated." "It's not obligation," Cordelia assured him. "It's choice. My choice. For the first time, I'm choosing where I want to be, not just accepting where circumstances have placed me." "And you choose here," Knox said, a statement rather than a question. "I choose here," she confirmed. "With you. And Hank and Tim, of course," she added hastily, suddenly shy. A smile spread slowly across Knox's face, transforming his serious features. "I'm glad," he said simply. "The ranch wouldn't be the same without you." They stood in companionable silence for a time, watching as more stars appeared in the velvety darkness above. The air held the promise of spring, a subtle shift from winter's grip that spoke of renewal and growth. "Cordelia," Knox said finally, turning to face her fully. "There's something I've been wanting to say to you, but I've been waiting for the right moment." Her heart quickened at his serious tone. "Yes, these past months having you and Tim here, it's shown me what I was missing before, not just a housekeeper or a boy to help with chores, but family. Connection." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I find myself thinking about you constantly, your smile, your strength, the way you faced every challenge with such grace." Cordelia's breath caught in her throat as she realized where his words were leading. "What I'm trying to say, rather poorly," Knox continued with a self-deprecating smile, "is that I've fallen in love with you. I understand if you don't feel the same way or if you need more time, but I wanted you to know." Joy bloomed in Cordelia's chest, warm and expansive. "Knox," she said softly, stepping closer to him, "I don't need more time. I've known my heart for months now. And," he prompted, hope kindling in his eyes. "And I love you too," she admitted, the words feeling both monumental and utterly natural. "I think I have since that first day when you offered me freedom instead of ownership." Knox's smile was brilliant in the starlight. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he drew her into his arms. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice husky. In answer, Cordelia rose on tiptoe, bringing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, almost reverent, before deepening into something more passionate as months of unspoken longing found expression at last. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Knox rested his forehead against hers. "I want to court you properly," he said. "If you'll allow it." Cordelia laughed softly, joy bubbling up irrepressibly. "I think we're beyond the need for formalities, don't you? We've lived under the same roof for nearly a year. All the same," Knox insisted. "You deserve to be courted like the extraordinary woman you are. If it pleases you," she conceded, touched by his old-fashioned sensibilities. "Though I warn you, my expectations are high after that Christmas gift." Knox chuckled, his arms tightening around her. "I'll do my best to meet them." As spring arrived in earnest, transforming the ranch with new growth and activity, Knox proved true to his word. Despite the demands of the season, calving, planting, and repairs to structures damaged by winter, he found time for courtship rituals that delighted Cordelia. He brought her wildflowers gathered during his rides, left poems from his small collection of books on her doorstep, and carved a pair of lovebirds that he presented to her one sunny afternoon. On Sundays, their official day of rest, he took her on picnics by the creek or rides to scenic vistas overlooking the ranch. Tim observed their burgeoning relationship with obvious approval. "Are you going to marry Knox?" he asked Cordelia bluntly one evening as they prepared dinner in their cabin. Cordelia nearly dropped the pot she was holding, startled by his directness. "He hasn't asked me," she replied, feeling her cheeks warm. "But he will," Tim stated confidently, "and you'll say yes." "Is that so?" she asked, amused by his certainty. "And how would you feel about that?" Tim considered the question seriously. "I think it would be good," he said finally. "Knox is a good man, and he makes you smile. You didn't smile much before." Cordelia's heart constricted at his simple observation. "No, I suppose I didn't," she acknowledged. "We didn't have much to smile about then." "We do now," Tim said, his young face solemn. "And if you married Knox, we'd be a real family again, like when Mother was alive." "Oh, Tim," Cordelia said softly, pulling her brother into a hug. "We're already a family, you and I. That will never change, no matter what happens." "I know," he said, returning her embrace briefly before squirming away with adolescent self-consciousness. "But it would be nice to have Knox as part of it officially." Cordelia couldn't disagree with that sentiment. The question Tim had so confidently predicted came on a warm evening in late May. Knox had invited Cordelia for a ride after dinner, leading her to a hilltop overlooking the ranch. The setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light, turning the creek into a ribbon of fire and the new grass into a sea of burnished emerald. "It's beautiful," Cordelia breathed, dismounting with Knox's assistance. "Yes," he agreed, though his eyes were on her rather than the view. "Cordelia, there's something I want to ask you." Her heart began to race as he took both her hands in his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "These past months have been the happiest of my life," he began. "Having you here, watching your relationship with Tim flourish, seeing the ranch come alive under your care. It's shown me everything I want for my future. And that future, if I'm fortunate enough, includes you as my wife." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a ring, a simple gold band set with a modest diamond that caught the light of the setting sun. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The one thing of hers I managed to keep. I've carried it with me for years, waiting for the right person to give it to." "Cordelia Frost, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears blurred Cordelia's vision as emotion welled up within her. From that terrible day on the auction block to this moment of perfect joy, the journey seemed both impossibly long and remarkably swift. "Yes," she said, her voice clear despite her tears. "Yes, Knox Weston, I will marry you." Knox's smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. He drew her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and partnership. When they returned to the ranch, Tim and Hank were waiting on the porch of the main house, their expectant expressions suggesting they had guessed the purpose of the evening ride. "Well," Tim demanded as they approached. Knox looked to Cordelia, letting her share the news if she wished. "We're getting married," she announced, unable to contain her joy. Tim whooped in delight while Hank's weathered face split into a wide grin. "About time," the old cowhand declared. "Been watching you two circle each other like nervous colts for months now." The wedding took place in early July, when the ranch was at its most beautiful. Cordelia had worried that the ceremony would be small due to their relative isolation, but word spread throughout the county, and on the appointed day, nearly 50 people gathered to witness their union. The residents of Miles City, many of whom had been present for Cordelia's near tragedy on the auction block, seemed especially eager to celebrate her happiness. They arrived bearing gifts and dishes for the wedding feast, their genuine warmth healing some of the wounds left by that earlier experience. Cordelia wore a new dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from a shop in Billings. Tim, proud in his first store-bought suit, walked her from their cabin to the arch of wildflowers Knox and Hank had constructed near the creek. Knox waited there, more handsome than she had ever seen him in a black suit and crisp white shirt. His eyes never left her as she approached, his expression a mixture of awe and adoration that made her heart swell. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, with vows they had written themselves. Knox promised to honor her independence even as they joined their lives, while Cordelia pledged to build a true partnership based on mutual respect and love. As they exchanged rings, Knox's a plain gold band that matched the setting of her engagement ring, Cordelia caught sight of her father standing at the back of the gathering, his expression unreadable. She had sent him an invitation, more out of duty than desire, never expecting him to attend. For a moment, their eyes met across the assembled guests. Then, surprisingly, he nodded once, a gesture that might have been congratulation or perhaps even apology, before turning and walking away, disappearing down the trail toward town. Cordelia felt no regret at his departure. That chapter of her life was closed. Today marked the beginning of something new and beautiful, a life chosen freely, with a man who had given her the greatest gift possible, the right to determine her own fate. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the circuit preacher declared. "Mr. Knox, you may kiss your bride." As Knox's lips met hers, sealing their union amid cheers and applause, Cordelia knew with absolute certainty that she had chosen correctly. The path that had begun on that terrible auction block had led her not to bondage, but to the truest freedom of all, the freedom to love and be loved in return. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food and drink to satisfy even the hardiest appetites. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, creating a magical atmosphere as neighbors and friends continued the festivities. Later, as the last guests departed, and Tim retired to what would now be his room alone in the cabin, soon to be expanded with Knox's help into a proper bunkhouse for him and the occasional hired hand, Knox led Cordelia to the main house, their house now, truly a home at last. On the porch he paused, turning to her with tender solemnity. "Welcome home, Mrs. Weston," he said softly. "I've been home for some time now," Cordelia replied, smiling up at him, "but I do like the sound of that name." Knox swept her into his arms then, carrying her over the threshold in the traditional manner that made her laugh with delight. Inside, the house had been transformed with fresh flowers and new curtains she had sewn from fabric chosen during their winter trip to town. "Are you happy?" Knox asked, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Completely," Cordelia assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "More than I ever believed possible." Their wedding night was a revelation of tenderness and passion that cemented their bond. In Knox's gentle hands, Cordelia discovered aspects of herself she had never known existed, while Knox found in her a partner whose strength and vulnerability complemented his own perfectly. As they lay together in the quiet hours before dawn, the future stretching before them like the vast Montana landscape, Cordelia reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. "What are you thinking?" Knox asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "I was thinking about choices," she replied honestly. "How the worst day of my life led to the best decision I ever made." "Coming to the ranch with me," Knox guessed. "No," Cordelia corrected him gently. "The choice came before that. When you said choose your own path, I chose to trust you." Everything else flowed from that one moment of faith. Knox pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'm grateful every day that you did." "So am I," she whispered, nestling against him as sleep began to claim them both. "So am I." The years that followed proved the wisdom of Cordelia's choice. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, with Knox managing the cattle operation while Cordelia developed a thriving sideline in breeding and training horses. Her natural affinity for the animals, combined with Knox's expertise, soon made their stock sought after throughout the territory. Tim grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day management of the ranch, as Knox's responsibilities expanded to include service on the county commission and the Territorial Cattlemen's Association. At 18, Tim briefly left to attend college in Denver, returning with new ideas for ranch management that blended modern techniques with traditional wisdom. Hank remained with them until his passing in 1886, by which time he had become more family than employee. They buried him on the hilltop where Knox had proposed to Cordelia, marking his grave with a headstone that reads simply, "Henry Morgan Friend, Mentor, Family." Children came to bless their union, first a son, James, born in the spring of 1878, followed by twin daughters, Margaret and Elizabeth, in 1880. Their youngest, another boy they named Henry after their dear friend, arrived in 1883, completing their family. Cordelia eventually did become a teacher, though not in the way she had initially imagined. As more families settled in the area, she established a small school on the ranch itself, teaching not only her own children but those of neighboring ranchers and the hands who worked for them. Her reputation for educational excellence spread, and students sometimes rode for hours each day to attend her classes. She also found time to pursue her writing ambitions, publishing stories in magazines, and eventually a novel based loosely on her own experiences. The book, titled Freedom's Choice, earned modest acclaim and provided an additional source of income for the ranch during lean years. Knox supported all her endeavors wholeheartedly, his pride in her accomplishments evident to everyone who knew them. Their partnership, founded on mutual respect and genuine affection, became a model for their children and the community around them. In 1901, as the new century dawned with its promises of technological marvels and societal changes, Knox and Cordelia celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. The ranch had grown considerably by then, encompassing over 5,000 acres of prime Montana land, with modern improvements that would have seemed unimaginable when they first began their life together. For the occasion, their children organized a grand celebration that brought together friends and family from across the country. James, now a successful lawyer in Helena with a wife and 2 children of his own, acted as master of ceremonies. The twins, both married to ranchers whose properties adjoined the Weston land, coordinated the feast, while young Henry, recently graduated from veterinary school, ensured that the ranch operations continued smoothly during the festivities. Tim, who had established his own successful ranch 20 miles away, arrived with his wife and 3 children, his obvious happiness a constant source of joy for Cordelia. At the height of the celebration, Knox surprised Cordelia by leading her away from the gathering to the same hilltop where he had proposed a quarter-century earlier. Age had added silver to his hair and lines to his face, but his eyes still held the same warmth that had captured her heart all those years ago. 25 years, he marveled, taking both her hands in his. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I saw you standing on that auction block. Other times, it seems as though we've always been together. The best 25 years imaginable, Cordelia agreed, squeezing his hands, though I could have done without that terrible beginning. Knox's expression grew serious. I've been thinking about that day a lot lately, he admitted. About how close we came to never finding each other. If I hadn't decided to go to town that particular day, if I hadn't been passing by at that exact moment. But you were, Cordelia reminded him gently. And you did what many men wouldn't have done. You stood up for a stranger, at considerable cost to yourself. Best investment I ever made, Knox said with a smile, pulling her close. Look at all it's brought us: 4 wonderful children, a thriving ranch, a life better than anything I could have imagined when I was a lonely cowhand. And it all began with a choice, Cordelia said softly, echoing the conversation from their wedding night. Your choice to help, my choice to trust. Everything flowed from there. I have something for you, Knox said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in silver paper, to commemorate the occasion. Cordelia unwrapped it carefully to reveal a locket almost identical to the one he had given her that first Christmas, which she still wore daily. When she opened this new one, however, she found it already contained 2 miniature photographs, one of Knox as he had been when they met, young and serious, and one of him as he was now, his face etched with experience but his eyes still bright with the same essential goodness. For memories made, Knox said, referencing his words from that long-ago Christmas. And memories yet to come. Tears of joy welled in Cordelia's eyes as she clasped the locket around her neck alongside its predecessor. It's perfect, she whispered, rising on tiptoe to kiss him despite the audience they might have on the distant celebration grounds. Thank you for 25 magnificent years. Thank you for choosing me, Knox replied, his arms encircling her waist. Every day you choose me and I choose you. That's what makes this work. As they stood together on the hilltop, overlooking the ranch that had grown from Knox's vision and flourished under their joint care, Cordelia felt a profound sense of rightness. The path that had begun in fear and uncertainty had led to this moment of complete fulfillment, a life rich with love, purpose, and the deep satisfaction of choices well made. To the next 25 years, she said, leaning into her husband's embrace as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. And beyond, Knox agreed, his kiss a promise that, like all his others, she knew he would keep.